Hi, my name is Stephanie, and the book I'm going to read to you today is called Barefoot, Escape on the Underground Railroad. It was written by Pamela, Duncan, Edwards, and illustrated by Henry Cole. Now, this story takes place at night, and the artwork in the book can be a little dark and hard to see. So we're going to turn our camera around and we're going to focus on the book while I read you the story. So here's the cover of the book. And you see when you open it up, it has a dedication in it. This book was given to the children of West Richmond Friends by Rich and Nancy Sinex in memory of Rich's father, Alan Sinex. The Barefoot didn't see the eyes watching him as he ran onto the overgrown pathway. His breath came in great gasps. In the hours since he'd run from the plantation, he had traveled faster and farther than ever in his life. He was fearful of what lay before him. He was terrified of what lay behind. The heron's keen eyes had spotted the Barefoot moving furtively toward the pathway. The heron's warning cry had been a signal to the other animals. They had seen many bare feet along their pathway, and they had seen some of them being led away in ropes by the heavy boots. There's the heron. The Barefoot stopped and leaned wearily against the trunk of a loblolly pine. He raised a bottle to his lips. It was empty, and no water flowed to his mouth. Then from a few feet away came the urgent croaking of a frog. It sang out its message into the night. Fresh water, fresh water. The Barefoot moved toward the sound and drank deeply. Looking back along the pathway, the Barefoot made a decision. He sank down in the tall marsh grass, his head on his arms. There was a rustling sound. His heart pounding, the Barefoot slowly raised his head and saw a white-footed mouse nibbling a wild berry. The white-footed mouse scurried away as the Barefoot reached for a handful of berries, stuffing them into his mouth with a frantic hunger. From the branches of a cherry tree, a mockingbird began to sing. Looking up at the tree, the Barefoot watched a squirrel disappearing into its nest of twigs and leaves. With an exhausted sigh, the Barefoot pulled a thick blanket of leaves over himself. He closed his eyes and rested. But the heron, standing sentinel, broke the silence. His warning cry echoed along the pathway. The heavy boots were closing in on their prey. It was too late for the Barefoot to find safety. Loud voices and trampling feet grew nearer. "We'll get him," cried a voice. "He'll soon be back where he belongs," laughed another. One of the heavy boots kicked at a rock in his path. Suddenly, out of the grass rose a great army of mosquitoes. The heavy boots stopped within inches of where the Barefoot lay. Dozens of mosquitoes attacked, biting hands and faces and through clothing. The heavy boots moved away from the marsh grass, slapping and cursing. Ahead of them, a shape darted across the pathway. A crackling of branches brought cries of "There he is!" as the heavy boots crashed their way into the thick undergrowth. They cursed again and slashed at greenbrier and poison ivy as the deer led them farther and farther away from where the Barefoot lay trembling. The mosquitoes returned to their hideaways amid the grass. The mockingbird sang again. The Barefoot looked at his body in awe. Not one mosquito bite was to be seen. Hidden along the pathway, the animals watched the Barefoot. He walked straighter than before, knowing he had eluded his pursuers. The pathway opened to a wider area. Trees had been felled and logs stacked as if for a fire. Standing a little way off was a house. The animals heard a quick intake of the Barefoot's breath. Did this house represent safety or danger? The Barefoot strained to see the house, but the moon remained behind thick clouds. Then out from the trees flew firefly after firefly. Their tiny lanterns sparkled and flashed as the Barefoot moved silently forward. His eyes suddenly made out the shape of a quilt hanging at the house, in the front of the house. This was the signal of welcome for which the Barefoot had been hoping. As he reached the quilt, a door opened and a warm light flooded through. With wonder on his face, the Barefoot glanced back at the pathway he had traveled. He slipped through the door, the noises of the animals following him. To the Barefoot's ears, the sounds were a salute to courage. Silence fell again along the pathway, and the animals slept. But through their dreams, the heron's cry once again screamed a warning. Another Barefoot was approaching. Now there's an author's note here about this book. I'm going to read it to you. The pathway along which the runaway slave in this story traveled was part of the Underground Railroad, a network of courageous people who helped pass runaways from one safe house to another northward to freedom. There were many signals used to show a runaway that it was safe to approach a house. Special songs, a lantern shining from a particular window, and often a quilt hung over a porch rail or a clothesline. When the Barefoot saw the quilt hanging in front of the house in the clearing, he knew he would be safe until he continued his journey the following night. Most slaves, like the Barefoot, had worked in a plantation field at some time. They were familiar with animal signs. The Barefoot knew there must be fresh water nearby when he heard the frog croaking. Of course, the animals had no idea they were helping this brave Barefoot. Or do you think perhaps they did? So that was Barefoot. Escape on the Underground Railroad. I can't quite get it all the way in the frame. There we go. Thanks for listening.